question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I thank the Minister for his adumbration of the legislation, and note that the position that we had taken, and certainly I had taken when this legislation was foreshadowed in the Prime Minister's speech a few weeks ago, and when the bill itself had been publicised over the weekend, is to look askance at the provisions that constitute a further erosion of people's freedoms and liberties, particularly the claim for the need for warrantless surveillance for a period of up to 48 hours, and the cancellation of passports for up to 3 years, an extension from the current 1-year period, and the suspension of passports for those who are travelling overseas, because they do constitute issues and matters of removal of rights, which when this House is dealing with them, we should take considerable care. And my position had been that we needed to see a case from the government about the circumstances in which these sorts of powers might be needed, or the circumstances that might justify these powers, particularly the warrantless surveillance. And it is fair to say, Mr Speaker, that there is still some nervousness on our side about the provision as it appears in the bill. I have had a briefing myself from the SIS, and I have had explained to me circumstances in which the need for the security agency to be able to respond quickly and efficaciously to a threat or to a set of circumstances is needed because of the speed with which the people operating in this sphere now act. It was explained to me about what is needed to obtain a warrant under our security legislation, and it is an involved process. I happen to think that's a good thing, because the warrants that are applied for allow our security officials to take action under the cloak of secrecy, as they must do, and as is the nature and security work, but they constitute a massive erosion of privacy and of civil rights. So there should be effective checks and balances, and it should be a deliberative and careful process to obtain a warrant in order for state officials to breach privacy and to act against people's civil rights. The briefing I had took me through the process it takes to get a warrant, and there are requirements. There are very narrow statutory requirements that must be met. There is a vetting of the application. There needs to be an affidavit. There needs to be accompanying information and exhibits that go with the affidavit. That is all a good thing, but that, of course, takes time. And yet there are people who are operating against our national security interests and indeed international security interests who act much more quickly than that, and for whom or about whom it is desirable that our security agencies are able to gather information in order to evaluate and, if necessary, counter the threat that they pose or the risk that they pose. So I understand that and I get that. And I also think that New Zealanders, generally speaking, want to know that they live in a safe and secure country. And they want their security agencies to be effective. They want them to have the correct powers so that the nation is safe and that they are safe in the streets and in their homes. But I also think it is the New Zealand tradition to make sure that when the powers of the state are being exercised and powers of state that are compulsive and that do erode civil liberties, that there are good and proper checks and balances. And so on that basis, Mr Speaker, we say let's have a good close examination of this bill. Let's accept that there are security threats today that we had not foreseen 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and that the security climate and the security environment is a constantly changing beast, and that it has changed in the last 10 years at least. And so we need to know that the right powers and the right commitment and the right equipment and the right capability is available to our security officials to do their job and to keep us safe. So we say let's have a close examination of the bill. We will ask some questions. We will ask, do we need to allow a 48-hour period for the security agencies to obtain or to have a period of 48 hours where they can undertake surveillance video surveillance if necessary, without a warrant? Or is it possible for a warrant to be obtained in less than 48 hours? And if there is to be a suggestion that even if there is a much more truncated period of time, that a period of warrantless surveillance might be validated in retrospect. I personally think that is more problematic than simply having a warrantless period. But let's have a look at those provisions. Let's have a proper examination of them. Let's hear from the experts. Most importantly, let's hear from New Zealanders and those who feel a special interest in this and who want to have their say. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we will have something to say about the process that the government has entered into in this legislation, the urgency and the need to get it passed so quickly. The Prime Minister laid out the threats that this bill seeks to address some weeks ago, a good 3 or 4 weeks ago, and there's been one session of the House since that time, and now we're in the second session, and now the government brings the legislation on for urgency. So the committee will want to see some assessment, some appreciation of the need for that urgency as we consider it. The shorter amount of time we have available to consider legislation, and most importantly to hear from our citizens about it, then often the worse the legislation is when it comes to be passed. So we do urge the government to look carefully at the process and the time frame that it is given for the passage of this legislation to allow New Zealanders to have a fair chance to make a comment on it. And let's have a good discussion and a good debate on whether the legislation needs to go as far as it does. I've talked about the 48-hour warrantless period. There is then the period for cancelling passports. And if it is to be 3 years and an increase from the 1-year period at the moment, are there enough safeguards so that somebody who is wrongly caught up in a set of allegations or an incorrect threat assessment can apply to have their cancellation of their passport reviewed in a time that is much less than 3 years. What we don't want to see is that if somebody is the subject of an incorrect threat assessment, they lose their passport and it is years before they can get it back. There's got to be an effective appeal process or judicial review process that means that they can get it back in an efficient and effective amount of time. So with those sorts of provisos, Mr. Speaker, we say let's look at this bill and let's pay close attention to those provisions that do take away the rights and privileges that citizens in New Zealand have and ordinarily expect. We don't want to be drawn into the panic response that sometimes the promotion of security legislation is often promoted in. And we know there are threats, and we know also that the security agencies often have access to information that they cannot disclose without revealing their own tactics and their own approaches they need to take. But let's not also, get into the process of causing scare, causing fright as a basis to justify this legislation. Let us have a good and honest examination and a good and honest debate about it. And finally, the other provision relates to the suspension of passports for people who are abroad, and the removal of their travel documents, of course, puts them in an extraordinarily difficult position. And we would just ask the government, when they are part of the committee process shepherding the legislation through, that very careful consideration is made of this, because this is a very serious step to take for people, for New Zealand citizens, when they are travelling. On that basis, Mr. Speaker, let us send this bill to the Select Committee for a closer examination. Let us hear from New Zealand citizens, let us hear from the experts, and let us see whether we can make this bill a good and balanced piece of security legislation that acknowledges and respects citizens' rights, acknowledges and respects the modern security threats that New Zealand faces. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Amy Adams.
Mr. Speaker, I think